The Vietnam War, 1955–1975, remains one of the most complex and controversial conflicts in American history, culminating in a defeat that reshaped U.S. foreign policy and national identity. The reasons behind America's loss are multifaceted, rooted in military, political, social, and strategic failures, as well as the resilience and adaptability of the North Vietnamese and their Viet Cong allies. Below, I'll explore the key factors that contributed to the United States' inability to achieve its objectives in Vietnam, despite its overwhelming military and economic power. 1. Unclear objectives and strategic missteps. From the outset, the U.S. lacked a coherent and achievable goal in Vietnam. The primary aim was to contain communism under the domino theory, which posited that if South Vietnam fell to communism, other Southeast Asian nations would follow. However, this ideological framework didn't translate into a clear military strategy. Was the goal to defeat North Vietnam outright, prop up a stable South Vietnamese government, or simply prevent a communist takeover? The ambiguity led to a war of attrition rather than decisive victory. The U.S. adopted a strategy of limited war, avoiding full-scale invasion of North Vietnam to prevent escalation that might draw in China or the Soviet Union, as had happened in Korea. This self-imposed restraint, such as refraining from bombing Hanoi extensively until late in the war, or avoiding a ground invasion across the DMZ, hamstrung American military efforts. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese pursued a total war strategy, fully committing their resources and population to reunification under communist rule. 2. The strength and adaptability of the enemy. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and the Viet Cong, VC, proved to be formidable opponents. Under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giap, they employed guerrilla tactics that negated American technological superiority. The dense jungles, intricate tunnel systems, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a supply line running through Laos and Cambodia, allowed them to sustain their forces despite heavy U.S. bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder. The North Vietnamese were also fighting for a unifying national cause, independence and reunification. This gave them a level of morale and determination that the U.S. and its South Vietnamese allies struggled to match. Their willingness to endure staggering losses, estimated at over 1 million dead, reflected a resolve that American planners underestimated. The Tet Offensive in 1968, though a tactical defeat for the Communists, demonstrated their ability to strike unexpectedly and shattered U.S. confidence in a quick resolution. 3. Failure to win South Vietnamese hearts and minds. The U.S. relied heavily on the government of South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, or RVN, to maintain stability and legitimacy. However, the RVN was plagued by corruption, incompetence, and a lack of popular support. Leaders like Ngo Dinh Diem alienated much of the population through repressive policies, favoritism toward Catholics in a predominantly Buddhist country, and failure to address rural poverty. After Diem's assassination in 1963, with tacit U.S. approval, a series of unstable military juntas further weakened the South Vietnamese state. American efforts to win hearts and minds through programs like the Strategic Hamlet Initiative backfired. Relocating villagers into fortified hamlets to isolate them from the Viet Cong often fueled resentment, as it disrupted traditional ways of life. Meanwhile, U.S. tactics, such as widespread bombing, napalm, and Agent Orange, caused immense civilian suffering, driving many South Vietnamese into the arms of the Communists. 4. Domestic opposition and loss of public support. The Vietnam War was the first televised war, bringing its brutality into American living rooms. Images of burning villages, civilian casualties, and body bags eroded public support over time. The draft, which disproportionately targeted working-class and minority men, sparked widespread protests, especially among the youth. The 1968 Tet Offensive, though a military setback for the Communists, was a psychological blow to Americans who had been told victory was near. It fueled the perception that the war was unwinnable. Political divisions deepened as anti-war sentiment grew. The credibility gap, discrepancies between optimistic government statements and grim realities, undermined trust in leaders like Presidents Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. By the early 1970s, massive demonstrations, such as the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam, reflected a nation weary of the conflict. This domestic pressure forced policymakers to prioritize withdrawal over victory, culminating in the Paris Peace Accords of 1973. 5. Military tactics. Ill-suited to the conflict. The U.S. military was designed for conventional warfare. Tanks, air superiority, and large-scale battles, not the irregular guerrilla-style fighting of Vietnam. Search and destroy missions, while racking up high enemy body counts, often failed to hold territory or disrupt the communist insurgency long-term. The reliance on metrics like body counts as a measure of success distorted priorities, encouraging short-term gains over strategic progress. Moreover, the U.S. underestimated the logistical challenges of Vietnam's terrain and climate. Troops faced monsoons, heat, and disease, while supply lines were vulnerable to ambushes. The heavy use of air power and artillery, intended to break enemy will, often alienated civilians and failed to stop the flow of men and material from the north. 6. Vietnamization and the collapse of South Vietnam. Under President Nixon, the policy of Vietnamization aimed to shift combat responsibilities to the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, while withdrawing U.S. troops. However, the ARVN was poorly trained, underfunded, and lacked the morale to stand alone. When the U.S. withdrew most of its forces by 1973, South Vietnam was left vulnerable. Congress, reflecting public exhaustion, cut military aid in 1974, further weakening the RVN. In 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a final offensive, and Saigon fell on April 30th, marking the war's end. Conclusion. America's loss in Vietnam was not solely a military defeat, but a failure of vision, execution, and resolve. The U.S. overestimated its ability to impose its will on a distant nation, underestimated the tenacity of its adversaries, and misjudged the limits of its own society's tolerance for a protracted, inconclusive war. The North Vietnamese, by contrast, leveraged their unity, patience, and willingness to sacrifice to outlast a superpower. The war's legacy, 58,000 American lives lost, billions of dollars spent, and a fractured national psyche, continues to shape debates about intervention and power to this day.